So, Drew, do you think we're okay to go now? Yes, Drew's signaling.
Yeah, Jane can see us. That's great. I'll switch my mic off. Thank you.
So we're going to start now. We're going to start. So hello, everybody, and welcome to the Labour Business Online reception at the Labour Party Online Conference. As we're all virtual this year, I'm afraid I can't offer you the usual glass of chilled white wine and canapes, or even the more traditional glass of warm white wine. And what I can offer you is an outstanding lineup of keynote speakers and panelists from the Labour front bench, from business, and from the trade unions. I'm Hamish Sanderson, and I'm the chair of Labour Business. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome so many of our own members and so many members of the wider business community to our annual conference reception. Now, for those of you who don't know Labour Business, I should explain that Labour Business is the business membership organisation affiliated to the Labour Party. Our members are Labour Party members who own or run or hold management positions in businesses of all sectors and sizes up and down the country. Now, this morning, Keir Starmer mentioned Harold Wilson in his speech as one of only 3 election-winning Labour leaders since 1945. And in Labour Business, we're immensely proud that it was Harold Wilson in 1972 who founded the group that became Labour Business. And our mission, his mission then, and our mission now is a very simple one: to enable the Labour Party to have a conversation with the business community on the basis that if we don't listen to business, we can't expect business to listen to us. And at a time of unprecedented upheaval, that conversation has never been more important. Harold Wilson also spoke of his ambition for Labour to become the natural party of government. And echoing that ambition, we've called for Labour to become the natural party of business, as well as the natural party of workers and their trade unions. But let me be quite clear about this. We are not calling for Labour to be the party of business as usual. We want Labour to be the natural party for good businesses, businesses that treat their workers well, businesses that recognise trade unions, businesses that put their stakeholders and the future of the planet above short-term profit. What Anneliese yesterday called purposeful and responsible businesses. And our vision for the next Labour government is the same as the vision that Keir Starmer set out this morning, for a Labour government working in the national interest, hand in hand with businesses and trade unions. To get from here to there, we're going to carry on doing what Harold Wilson started doing in 1972, listening to businesses, small, medium and large, up and down the UK, through roundtables, forums and events like this. And on the back of our business engagement work, we're going to carry on collecting evidence to feed into the party's policy development process, working closely with Keir Starmer's new leadership team, with MPs and peers, with mayors and councillors, helping to develop evidence-based policies that are road-tested and deliverable on the ground. So we definitely don't see our business engagement work as a chat fest for the sake of it. It's a conversation with a purpose, to help Labour hold the government to account while we're in opposition and to develop a policy programme for Labour in government after the next general election. And if you want to get more involved in our business engagement and policy development work, I hope you'll consider joining Labour Business. You can join via our website, labourbusiness.org, and you'll find the link in the chat box. Before I introduce our first keynote speaker, I want to mention that we are joined today by 2 special guests. The first is Drew Ledson. I think you can see him on the panel, who is a lip speaker. He will enable anyone in the audience who is deaf and can lip read to be included in our discussion. The second special guest is Jane Cordell in the audience. Jane is a deaf public speaker and coach, co-director of Result Community Interest Company, and she helped to establish the brand new APPG on inclusive entrepreneurship. Labour Business is proud to support her campaign to bring greater inclusivity to the business world, and we urge other businesses and the Labour Party to join her campaign. It's now my very pleasurable duty to introduce our 4 keynote speakers. Probably the easiest job I've ever had as chair of Labour Business, because these outstanding speakers need no introduction. But just for the record, we are joined, or will shortly be joined, by Anneliese Dodds, Labour MP for Oxford East and Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer, Ed Miliband MP, Labour MP for Doncaster North and Shadow BEIS Secretary, Rachel Reeves, Labour MP for Leeds West and Shadow Chancellor of the Shadow Cabinet Office Secretary, and Francis O'Grady, the General Secretary of the TUC. In addition, we have an outstanding panel of leaders from politics and the business world on the panel. They are, not in any order of importance, Baroness Smith, Angela Smith, Opposition Leader in the Lords, Bill Esterson, Shadow International Trade Minister and a Vice President of Labour Business, Chi Onwurah, Shadow Minister for Science, Research and Digital, Stephen Kinnock, Shadow Foreign and Commonwealth Office Minister and a Vice President of Labour Business, Rajesh Agarwal, Deputy Mayor of London for Business, Peter Holbrook, CEO of Social Enterprise UK, Rose Marley, CEO of Sharp Futures, Roy Rickhus, General Secretary of Community, the trade union, Jude Curtin-Darling, former MEP, now Deputy General Secretary of Industrial All European Trade Union, and Catherine McGuinness, Policy Chair of the City of London Corporation. So here's the format. I will ask the first keynote speaker to speak for about 5 minutes, followed by 10 minutes in conversation with the panelists. Then I will ask the second keynote speaker to speak for about 5 minutes, followed by 10 minutes in conversation with the panelists, and so on for about an hour. Then after those 4 keynotes, I will open up the conversation to the audience to have a discussion with keynote speakers and panelists. And if you'd like to join in that, please use the Q&A button and put your question as we go along. Finally, to make life easier for Drew, our lip speaker, I would ask speakers not to cut across each other. I know you wouldn't do that. And to raise your hand if you're visible on the screen, or use the raised hand emoticons if you want to speak. And give your name before you speak as well. So it's Anneliese up first. Anneliese, I've invited you and the other keynote speakers to make some remarks around the theme of how we can make Labour the natural party for businesses as well as for workers and their trade unions. But I've made clear, I hope in my opening remarks, that we're not talking here about the natural party of bad business, but of good business. And yesterday you spoke about purposeful and responsible business. And I wondered if you'd like to expand on that for us. Anneliese Dodds.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Hamish, for that introduction. You know, it's so terrific to be part of this event with so many luminaries, really, I would say, from both the business world that's connected with Labour, but also, of course, other frontbenchers who I'm really proud to be able to work with. And I'm very, very proud of all the work that Labour Business has been doing. Actually, I think it's an incredibly important group that brings together business people from right across the UK in a whole range of different sectors, large and small, so that really we can work together to have that better, fairer economy. And now, of course, is such a critical time in trying to reach for that goal. And I think while we work together on that, we've really got to be clear that actually during this period, there's so much that we must be proud of. And very often it has come from business. It has come from those responsible and purposeful businesses. I mentioned in my speech yesterday the fact that I'm incredibly proud of the work that's gone on around the vaccine, for example, around different treatments that have been developed in the UK, around the work of manufacturers, hand in hand with trade unions that repurpose manufacturing facilities incredibly quickly to create ventilators, to provide PPE, to provide hand sanitizer and everything else. It's not the case that in the UK we lack ambitious business, we lack those values to push our country forward. The problem that we have now is we have a government which doesn't recognise that value, which isn't backing business, which doesn't support trade unions working with business, and which often has a very centralised approach to decision making, which is really holding us back in this country. Just wanted to offer a couple of reflections, really, particularly on what's happening today, because very obviously we are in very difficult times. We had all hoped that by now we might have been climbing out of this crisis. Unfortunately, clearly we have new restrictions coming back in, of course, those which have been present in a number of parts of our country, but being generalised across the UK. And we've got to be very, very clear. The responsibility for this is not to be carried by the British people. It is to be carried by a government which was warned time and time again by Labour that the test, trace and isolate system was not working, and which didn't take the necessary action to make sure that it was fixed before we had schools going back, universities going back, and so on and so forth. We have, of course, got those additional restrictions, but we don't now have the system of economic support there to support the public health efforts. So as you'd anticipate, we're calling on government, work with us, and it's very much using the same ethos that animates Labour business. Work with Labour as the opposition and business and trade unions, just as government did when they created the furlough scheme. Let's work together now. Let's devise a system of wage support which can keep businesses going, retain that critical economic capacity. Let's develop the system of training and retraining that we need. It's already the case that funding has been allocated, but into the future by government around this, when so many workers need it right now, particularly those who've become unemployed. And let's face up to the enormous debt challenge of so many businesses when those COVID loans start to be wound in again next year. Let's make sure that we have a system that will support businesses that will need to be investing next year and not put off that because of the debt load that they're carrying. And while we deal with those short-term issues, let's of course not take our eyes off the long-term prize, which is that of the green economy, the fairer economy of the future. And I find the work that Labour Business has done around this incredibly helpful. I'm sure that Ed and others will talk to this as well. We have an opportunity now to make sure that we're facing up to the environmental challenge in the same way as so many other countries. You look at the kinds of stimulus plans that, for example, Germany has been putting into place. It's putting into hydrogen technology about the same amount as the UK government is putting into all environmentally friendly technologies. We are losing out on that race. We're also not assessing funding against environmental criteria. We're not working with the grain of responsible businesses by putting conditions on future support, conditions that from my discussions with business, most businesses want to see put into place because it would prevent them being undercut by operators who don't hold to those public values. So let's work together on that. Really, really excited by this event and look forward to questions later on. Thank you, Hamish.
Thank you very much, Anneliese. And I think we may want to amend our slogan to talk about Labour as the natural party of purposeful and responsible businesses, because that's a phrase that I think is going to echo down this discussion. So thank you for your speech yesterday, Anneliese. As I said, the way this is going to work, I'm going to take 10 minutes of discussion among the panel before I go to our next keynote. So I'll take 2 or 3 at a time from the panel, please. Any question or comment that you'd like to put to Anneliese, and just show your hand or use the emoticon to speak. So I've got Roy first. Is anyone else wants to come in? Yes, Rose. Do I have a third? And I've got Peter. So Roy, Rose, and Peter. Would you like to go ahead? Roy first, please.
Thank you, Hamish. I'll be very brief. Just picking up on the comments, Anneliese, which I couldn't agree more with, about the green economy and what Labour would do in terms of making sure we have a fair and just transition to that green economy, because we do represent a lot of workers who provide good jobs, well-paid jobs, vital to the local economies and to the UK economy, that are working in industries, heavy industry, that are at the forefront of this change. And it was fantastic to hear you talk about what's happening in Germany around the work they're doing on hydrogen technology, because there's that plus carbon capture, etc., which can make our industries green and make sure we're in the forefront of being the solution, not what people see us to be as the problem. We're still going to need the products that we produce through heavy industry, And if we don't get it right, all we'll be doing is importing CO2 emissions from countries that are nowhere near as environmentally friendly as the UK is.
Thank you, Roy. Can we move to Rose, please?
Yeah, hi, Anneliese. I would like to find out from you, please, what role you believe that business has to play in levelling up and how you can incentivise businesses to consider the social impact of their operations as well as their profits.
Thank you, Rose. Peter Holbrook.
Hi, Anneliese. Good to see you. I suppose my question is, as someone that's been working in social enterprise nearly for 2 decades now, is I've been fighting the fight in terms of policy to get a level playing field for social enterprises and co-ops and mutuals in tax, in procurement, in all sorts of areas. My point really is surely it's now time not just to level that playing field, but to actually advantage businesses that do the right thing. And I wondered how you foresee using the tax system and various other levers within government, such as procurement and legislation and regulatory reform, to really tilt in favour of businesses that do the right thing.
Thank you, Peter. I've got more people who want to come in, but I'll take those 3 and hand back to Anneliese if you'd like to respond, Anneliese.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Hamish. I mean, Roy, first of all, I think you've set it out very clearly. There's enormous promise there, and there's very, very strong will, I would say, right across the piece for the UK to become really a world leader on a number of these technologies. But you know what frustrates me is that we've been talking about many of them for 10 years. You know, all those discussions about CCS, for example, about hydrogen, you know, whether it's the northeast of Scotland, whether it's Humber, many other parts of the country where there's the potential there, but we haven't seen 2 things. First of all, we've not seen that being backed with the kind of support that's necessary to come from government to initially de-risk some of those technologies. That is being put in place in Germany and other countries. That hasn't happened here. But secondly, there's also not the coordination there across particularly at the regional level that is necessary. There aren't the powers there to be able to make those kinds of transitions. And I was in the West Midlands last week at the LEVC companies, the electric taxi company. We had a manufacturing roundtable there with Liam Byrne and Jack Dromey and others. And they're time and time again, both trade unionists and industrialists saying, look, we have joint plans to do, you know, whatever it was. It was really exciting from an environmental point of view in a number of cases, district heating, for example, different forms of energy generation and use across companies, but we don't have the planning levers to be able to deliver that, and we're going in the wrong direction on that. We don't have the coordination with the energy grid either that's necessary. We don't have those relations that are required, and also around other forms of resource use. So we need to unblock those coordination challenges, help those who regionally have these kinds of visions, and then I think we have a very, very bright future. Rose, I think that business is critical here, and you know, it does frustrate me that I feel that sadly the current government, very often they'll use that phrase levelling up, but they just say it, they don't actually put it into practice at all. Of course, we've been going in the wrong direction around many of these regional inequalities recently. We see local authority funding going down, lots and lots of local councils saying they're going to have to cut staff, and particularly in those areas where the Conservatives say that they really want to level up. Just providing different prestige investments, you know, where a politician can have a picture of themselves with a hard hat from the Conservative Party, that is not levelling up. And particularly, I've been saying to government and others from the Labour side on this call, we've all been saying, look, if you really are genuinely going to be achieving change through investment, which the government have said now they want to put in after many years of underfunding, why aren't you applying conditions? Why aren't you going to ensure that it results in actually jobs in local areas, that we're not talking about, for example, very, very major firms coming in, delivering a project and then going away again without changing the local environment. But I would also say that when it comes to social impact, and I tried to talk a bit about this yesterday, I think quite often the image of business that's held, particularly by the Conservatives, is completely wrong, because businesses are social organisations. Very often they're closely embedded in the area that they operate. People who work within them are friends as well as colleagues. We need to reflect that really in the way that we talk about business. And I think obviously social enterprise and more socially responsible businesses are at the forefront of that. But let's not forget that it does occur across a lot of the private sector. And then that links to Peter's point, and I was really delighted that I was actually able to visit a social enterprise actually yesterday. Big thanks to Liz Minns, who's part of this event, for helping to organise all of that. Really trying to highlight the work that is being done in social enterprise around training, particularly people who are quite far away from the jobs market. What can we do to try and ensure that businesses do the right thing then are kind of favoured into the future? Well, I think we need to look at the flip side of that, the other side of the coin, and why it's the case that even though, for example, the Conservative government, even this government, has said that in procurement systems, we should be able to prevent companies that engage in bad tax practice from gaining contracts from governments, that there should be environmental criteria applied to spending and criteria around decent work. Why do we have in theory that situation, and yet we still don't have companies which demonstrate that often being awarded these contracts? Rachel, in particular, Rachel Reeves has been doing a lot of work around these kinds of questions about making sure that we really can use procurement to get the kind of economy that we need for the future, one that works right across the country, one that works for working people, for employees, as well as certain employers who seem to be particularly favoured by the government at the moment. This needs to be a much, much broader ecosystem into the future.
Thank you, Anneliese. I've got time for 3 more. So Catherine has already signalled, but those of you who've joined recently are also welcome to signal. And that doesn't include you, Drew. I'm not treating your signal as a request to speak at this point. So I've got Catherine, I've got Jude. Is there a third person who'd like to come in at this point with a comment or a question for Anneliese? Okay, let's start with Catherine then. Catherine?
3 quick points from principally financial professional services sector in mind, you know, the city, which our city, the square mile I look after, sort of aimed at. And the first is the point actually Anneliese made about businesses being social interests too, and I would say that's absolutely the case, partly because they do, and partly because actually their investors and their investors, big and small, are expecting them these days to pay much more attention to impact, climate challenges and so on. So the first point is how crucial it is in our current climate do see business as part of the answer to some of these challenges. Green finance, for example, is a great opportunity for us to look at how we can finance some of the projects that we need to build back better. It's also a great strength of London, so it's a competitive strength, and the UK actually, there are other expertise in that area around the UK. So it's also a great competitive strength of ours. Really important that we work together, and good to hear more about the partnerships with businesses as we look at that. Secondly, in more short term, you mentioned the heavy indebtedness that companies will be facing coming out of this COVID period, and it's going to be a huge challenge. The sector has come up with some suggestions around how to recapitalise some of the companies that are struggling, and also how to find growth capital for them. And it would be good to hear what you think about partnership on that front too. But finally, I want to come back to where you started, actually, and real concern about the proposal today for tightening our response to the virus. Concern, of course, about the growth of the virus and the fact that we need to take measures, and I'm not saying we don't, but I'm also really worried about where the guidance on return to the workplace, to the office, is taking us. Safety has to be paramount. Workplaces have to be COVID secure, but I'm having sort of cries of distress from firms that, for all sorts of reasons, want to see some of their employees back in the office working safely. So the challenge that I'm putting out to everybody is how can we find a way of living with this virus so that we can enable a certain amount of return to our city centres for all sorts of reasons, including the economic damage that it's causing that they're not there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Jude, next.
Yeah, hello everybody, and hello Anneliese. It's very nice to see you, my former MEP colleague. I wanted to come back to your point about international comparisons and some of the comparison with Germany. Now, as Deputy General Secretary of Industry All, which represents manufacturing workers right across 38 European countries, we're analysing the recovery plans from different countries, and there is clearly a level of national competition going on for who will lead in these green technologies. You mentioned the German plan on hydrogen. Equally, the French national plan has mirrored exactly the German national plan. But what we're also seeing across Europe is that governments and business are coming together very, very clearly to recognise that coming out of the crisis is going to take longer, and therefore furlough schemes, short-time working, Kurzarbeit, however you term it, has to be extended. And increasingly across Europe, those schemes are being extended right into next year, and in some cases even further. So I just wonder how useful you think the activities of our neighbours, well, I'm on the continent, I'm on the other side of the channel, but how useful it is to be feeding in the activities of our European neighbours to try and shame or push the government to really take a responsible agenda in the UK, because we risk finding ourselves as we did in 2008, where a lot of people left their jobs, moved away from industry, and then it's very difficult to build back up what you've lost. Whereas our competitors, if you like, in that sense, are learning the lessons of 2008 very, very quickly, are keeping people close and are hoping to be ready for the recovery. So your thoughts on that would be really useful. Thanks.
Thank you, Jude. I'll go back to Anneliese now, because I calculate that Catherine managed to fit in at least 3 points in her one question. That means Jude has added a fourth. So I think we'll stop the rounds of comments and questions now. Anneliese, would you like to respond? And then you'll be free to go or very welcome to stay as long as you can. But Anneliese, if you'd like to respond now, that'd be great.
Great. Well, thanks very much indeed, Catherine. Very good to see you, and thank you for those really important questions. First of all, I really do think there's a strong shared agenda here, and I talk to a lot of different investors around this. I mean, there's an enormous value of assets under management, far more than actually the firepower of any government acting on its own, particularly if the UK government. There's a shared agenda in dealing with those long-term issues that threaten economic prosperity and sustainability. And so I think there is a huge amount that can be done together. I think it's important that we recognise these markets are international. Therefore, when it comes to the Green Finance Initiative, for example, yes, of course, we should have a tailored approach from the UK, but let's not cut our nose off to spite our face. Let's make sure that we do play our part in ensuring that there are, for example, systems for assessing changes in carbon emissions, etc., that can be used across countries, that we're not cutting ourselves out of that for the future. And let's really build on the excellent practice that's already going on. I think, the principles for responsible investment, many of the really innovative approaches that are being taken in the UK and elsewhere are very, very interesting indeed. Around recapitalisation, yes, absolutely, and in fact that was the third strand of the kind of 3 steps really that I set out yesterday in my speech, as well as recovering jobs, so more targeted version of wage support, then also retraining. I was also calling for government to really engage with that question about debt that's going to be coming up in stark relief from the end of next March, but which is already consuming, of course, many, particularly smaller businesses, thoughts at the moment, at a time when we really need them to be thinking about investments and, if at all possible, thinking about taking people on for the future. I think there's exciting ideas, obviously, from City UK, others also from Social Enterprise UK, a number of different bodies now talking about how that debt issue could be dealt with. And obviously, I've been discussing this a lot with Ed Miliband, who's going to be speaking later. And then just finally, I think that issue around guidance is really critically important. And, I've talked to a lot of businesses about this. They want to do the right thing. They want to do the right thing for their staff. the right thing for the public health emergency that we're faced in, the right thing for their company. And it's been very, very hard for them, actually, with mixed messages that have been circulating. Obviously, Labour have said that we want there to be clear communication. We support measures that are put into place by government. We don't want to contribute to confusion around those messages, but we do want to have much more clarity coming from government around these different questions. I mean, the fact, for example, that we had that, quite radical kind of reversal in position coming from government today, but then nothing around, well, what will actually be there to support those businesses that then are going to be impacted by this, I think is an example of how this isn't fully joined up, and it needs to be as a matter of urgency. Jude's point, yes, absolutely. And I think that we're already seeing, very worryingly, a number of companies themselves looking at that comparison and deciding, because the UK isn't having that longer term commitment, they're not going to retain jobs in our country. Arguably, that's already happened in aerospace. I'm very concerned about it indeed, because I agree with you. Once those kinds of high technology engineering jobs are gone, not only does that have a knock-on impact across the supply chain, which can be very critical in particular places, it's also very, very difficult to build those jobs back up again. And as you say, it can take years. And I'm conscious that this is a problem, particularly for many areas where without those kinds of jobs, there will not be the kind of dynamic economy that we need to see for the future. I mean, over the summer, visited the four corners of the UK, including North Wales, talking to people involved in aerospace there. They're really concerned about this. And I think the question is not whether we can afford to have that targeted support, but whether we can afford to be losing very significant parts of the UK's economic capacity because of too short-sighted an approach now.
Anneliese, thank you again so much for being so generous with your time today, as you have been in the past. And it's really lovely to see you, and we look forward to seeing you again in the near future. And I want to turn now to our next speaker, but as I say, you'd be really welcome to stay as long as you can, but we won't hold it against you if you have other things you need to do. So I turn next to our second keynote speaker, none other than Ed Miliband, Shadow Secretary of State for BEIS. And again, it's lovely to see you back at a Labour business event, Ed. You've been very generous with your time as well. And I think you arrived a little bit late, so we were talking around the theme of making Labour the natural party of business. And I made very clear when I said that at the beginning that we're not talking about any old business. We're talking about businesses that put their stakeholders first, and in particular, that put the future of the planet first above short-term profit. So I think our members and our audience will be very interested to hear from you, picking up from what Anneliese was saying about how you see the green agenda fitting into that ambition for Labour to become the natural party of businesses, as well as the natural party of workers and their trade unions. So if I give you 5 minutes for some opening remarks, and then we'll have a 10-minute session, as we just did with Anneliese, with the panelists. Ed, you are most welcome.
Thanks so much, Hamish. And look, can I first thank Labour Business for the fantastic work you do on behalf of the Labour Party and indeed on behalf of business. And also I want to thank our excellent array of panelists. You get the sort of 6 p.m. on a Tuesday Zoom award for being on this call. Though genuinely, we are incredibly grateful because you're all incredibly busy people. You've got many things to do. So it is really kind of you to be on this, and also to the people who are listening in. Look, I just want to make 3 simple arguments, Hamish, because I think the way this will work best is as a dialogue. First, I think it's really important to say, and for people to be in no doubt, that we are a pro-business party. We need more businesses making profits, creating wealth, creating jobs in our country. And I think there should be no doubt about that. And I think if you think about what has been happening during this crisis, I hope that we have shown both being a constructive opposition, but also we need to save every business that we can that is under threat in this crisis. because it's not only morally right, and I think it is morally right, the pandemic is the ultimate collective action problem. And if we let businesses go to the wall because they're having to close or operate at reduced capacity because of public health measures, we are basically saying to those businesses and indeed those workers, you're on your own. You're left on your own. And I think that is the wrong thing for us to do as a country. And that's why Anneliese and I and Rachel and Bridget Phillipson and so on have been so strong, Keir have been so strong on this issue of extending the furlough and indeed learning from what is happening in continental Europe. And I think today, frankly, it presses the alarm button even more in my mind. The only way we get through this is with the economic measures supporting the public health measures. And as we discussed at our shadow cabinet earlier, the gulf between the health measures and the economic measures is widening. And that is really a massive problem. And I think the government should be coming to the House of Commons this week to announce how they're gonna close that gap, because I think there's massive risks for businesses. And I thought Catherine's point earlier on about the guidance on whether people should be returning to work, what should be happening at the workplace is really important. Remember, 3 weeks ago, the government was briefing that you could be fired if you didn't return to work. And now the message has changed completely. That is not the kind of clear communication that we need. Secondly, and this looks a bit beyond the crisis, Hamish, because I think we'll probably end up consuming our discussion with the crisis, but I want to look beyond the crisis as well, even though that's hard. We're a party that wants to change our economy, not against business, but with business. And, I think it's really interesting about this crisis because the state and private sector have really shown an ability to work together in extraordinary ways. I think Anneliese talked about the ventilator production, the PPE production. Businesses have both stepped up and indeed their workers have stepped up in this crisis. And they've also closed when asked to do so. And in turn, businesses turned to government and said, look, if we're going to close, if we're going to step down our activity, you've got to support us. I think there is a lesson. Obviously, that isn't going to go on forever, but there's a lesson here about how we tackle the massive challenge we face. And I think it's really important this. We do not want to just go back, as Keir has said, to business as usual. Yes, it would be good to get back to normal. That's what we would all want at the moment. But the economy we had was too unproductive, too insecure, too unequal, too high carbon. And it's got to be state and private sector. And indeed, I think I'm looking at Francis on this call, the role that trade unions have played in this crisis, and indeed Roy. There is a lesson here about the partnership we can have to change our country and change our economy. And we face massive challenges. Climate, as you mentioned, Hamish, which can be a chance for us to create really important jobs in our country as we tackle the climate crisis. Automation, what the post-COVID world looks like. We can only tackle these challenges if we do so together. That's my second point. And then the third point I want to make is, I think, and this is, in a sense, if I may put it this way, where the debate has changed a bit since when I was leader, I think we can pursue this agenda, and I think it's important that Labour does, with a coalition led by business, because there are so many businesses that want to lead this change. And I think this is really striking. If you take the climate agenda and the leadership that the CBI has shown. So Carolyn Fairburn was saying to me that one of her earlier this week, one of her proudest moments was writing to the government saying, I want you to lead on the 2050 target, and that's what my members, the net zero target, and that's what my members want as well. If you think about the issue of whether we have a stakeholder company or a shareholder company, the issue of shareholder primacy, you see the B Corps leading that debate, and lots of businesses saying, hang on a minute, we've got to rethink the nature of the company on the basis of what we can learn about what works. If you take industrial policy, our manufacturers leading that debate about wanting to go green and wanting not just in word a strategic industrial policy, but indeed as well. And I think it's incredibly striking how this debate has changed. So I think we are a pro-business party. We do want to see change in our economy. We think we can build a coalition for that change with business. And I think that's a really exciting opportunity. A couple of final things I'll say. I think we should be under no illusions about the scale of the task for Labour or the scale of the task for the country, frankly. And yet, when we have faced these crises before, in particular, and I know it's overdone, but when we faced the Second World War, think how much better what we built afterwards was. I mean, it is, you know, it's just sort of remarkable to think back on that government. And in a way, there was a lot of cross-party consensus on this, but I think it's remarkable what that government did. And in a sense, I think the crisis should not make us lower our ambition about what we need to do for our country. It should make us raise our ambition, because people have suffered so much. And Keir said this in his acceptance speech in April. People have suffered so much in this crisis. And the least we owe them is to recognize the lessons that we should learn about how we create a more productive economy, how we create a more secure economy, how we create a better welfare state, how we have a public realm that works. And I think that is a really, really exciting agenda. And the thing I'd say finally to business people on this call is, I think that many business people have been shocked by this government and how cavalier they have been about many important issues, not just in the last 2 weeks around international law, but around Brexit, around the prospect of a no-deal Brexit. And I would say to business people, if you're looking for a party that is pro-business, pro-worker, I think Labour can fill that vacancy. And I think many business people want that home. We obviously have to earn the right for people to call Labour their home, but I think that's what we want to do.
Thank you very much, Ed, for that very stimulating series of remarks. And just to reassure you, yes, we do want to look beyond COVID. We can't ignore COVID, but we also want to look at more distant horizons as well. So can I ask for comments from the panel? Questions, comments, observations? Who would like to go first? I'm looking. Yes, I've got Rose, I think, is signaling. And who else would like to come in? Peter is signaling. Do I have a third who'd like to come in? Yes, and Chi. Okay, so Rose, if you'd like to kick off, please. We'll take that round of questions and then come back to Ed.
Hi, Ed. My business, Sharp Futures, based in Manchester, predominantly works with young people. And there's a lot of challenges around young people and employment at the moment, but there are also lots of opportunities. And there's opportunities around Industry 4.0. So as much as there are challenges in things like the gig economy, there are opportunities as well. So I'd just like to get a better understanding of how Labour intends to demonstrate that it's pro-business and pro-worker, and how those two can coexist happily in a Labour vision.
Thank you, Rose. Peter next.
Yeah, hi Ed, Peter from Social Enterprise UK. We've got a very, very dynamic kind of part of our economy with the startup sector, and we see, you know, a huge number of new social enterprises, but new business startups still register through the COVID crisis. We've also got, I think, a major issue which no one's touched on yet around the City of London's role in some of the worst aspects of kind of economic development, money laundering. New papers recently leaked, you know, again point to London as having, you know, some of the worst regulation, and even the British Academy's work suggests that we've got the most liberalised free market economy now of anywhere in the world, including countries like US and Australia and Canada. We've got some real macro problems as well as some micro problems. How do we really, really back the startup community, but tackle some of those, you know, generational problems that we've had emerge over years and years and years of financial liberation that still sit and are the antithesis of responsible business right here in the UK economy, channeling tens of billions of pounds every day?
Thanks, Peter. And Chi next.
Thanks very much, and really just wanted to obviously support everything that Ed said, and to draw just a point from my own personal experience. I like to say that I went straight from the socialist state of Newcastle upon Tyne to working as a chartered engineer, actually for an American Canadian company, and I spent 20 years in the private sector. And what in terms of what I felt in the best companies, the businesses, was that there was a real recognition that what was what their greatest assets were their people. And that was absolutely where kind of my Labour values and the business values that my companies I was working for were promoting absolutely overlapped, in terms of valuing their people as the key competitive differentiator and the greatest source of their competitive advantage, and as an investment to invest it in. And I think we've seen with the gig economy a kind of often a commoditization of people. And I wonder what I think what Ed sees as the opportunities in the change in technology to promote people as a set, the valuing of people, and the opportunity to compete on those terms, rather than a race to the bottom that we can also see.
Hamish, can I just ask Rose a quick question? But she said in the chat that I voted to get her as a judge. I voted for her to get money in 2008, which is good news. Tell us about, just tell me a little bit about, remind me about Sharp Futures and also the audience, Rose.
So it was at a Good Deal social enterprise conference, and it was for social investment, and there was like a Dragon's Den.
And what does Sharp Futures do? Remind us what Sharp Futures does.
It's a creative digital social enterprise that gets young people into tech and the creative industries.
I think that's really important. I mean, look, these are really excellent questions, which sort of speak to, I guess, the themes that we need to be pursuing over the coming years. That the questions may be better than the answer. I suppose I think I would start where what Chi's question was, which is what strikes me, and the people on this call will be much better informed on this than me. What strikes me is that the law is behind where most businesses are in our country. The law asserts a principle of shareholder primacy. Many businesses are straining at the leash for a business that lives to a much wider set of values. That's what they want. That's in practice. I think you've seen this so graphically during the crisis. But I think beyond the crisis, that's what so many businesses want to do, partly because they think it's the right thing to do, because they've got good values themselves, partly because I think it's what their workforce demands. People want a company that lives by its values. BlackRock in 2019 issued this, Larry Fink issued this statement warning companies that the biggest single challenge they faced was younger workers in particular, who wanted companies that lived by their values. And yet I sort of feel the law and public policy can be behind that. I mean, Rose, just to sort of answer your question directly about the gig economy, and it sort of ties in with what she said, the way I think about it is this, which is why, and I don't want to romanticize the period after the Second World War, but why did that bargain deliver in certainly in many ways? Partly, and we're not going back to that, we can't go back to that, as Keir said today, but we can learn lessons. It partly delivered because risk was shared. Risk was shared between government, business, and the workforce. And I think where sometimes the economy isn't working for people today is when risk is all piled onto the individual. So in aspects of the gig economy, and it's completely wrong to generalize, but in aspects of the gig economy, all of the risk is on the individual, and none of the risk is taken by business or government. And I don't think that's a recipe for a secure society or a successful society or a successful economy, frankly. And so I think part of this, and this is complicated, and obviously we're not at the stage of announcing policy, part of this is how do you make sure that risk is properly sort of distributed? And by the way, it's not just in the gig economy either. It's also in other jobs in our economy. And if risk is all loaded into the individual, you get very insecure individuals, and all kinds of things result from that. So that's the sort of general answer, but that's the kind of way I think about this this issue. But I think it's really important to emphasize there are massive opportunities in the tech sector, massive opportunities, and we should be incredibly proud of what our tech sector is doing. And I've intervened recently on the whole question of ARM and what happens to ARM, because it's such an important part of our ecosystem. So that's kind of my thought. Peter, I'm sure Catherine will have things to say about your intervention around the City of London. Look, I think that there can be broad agreement. We do not want to play host to bad practices. And the question is where the line is drawn and how we tackle that. But it's absolutely got to be part of the kind of economy we create, that we clamp down on the things that that you mentioned. And by the way, if I can just sort of say in passing, I think the other thing that your sector shows, and I was the Minister for the Social Enterprises in 2007, is that we have a pluralism of models in this country, and I think we should both celebrate and nurture that pluralism of models. Social enterprise, co-ops, everybody thinks it's all the public listed company is the basic only way to go. Actually, there's lots of models, and I think that diversity of models actually serves us well as a country, and all of the models can accommodate the kind of values that I think we share. It's not just one model produces those values. All of those models can do that.
Thank you, Ed. We're kind of running out of the 15-minute slot, and I'm also conscious that Rachel's going to have to leave shortly. This is where this kind of resembles a real reception at conference where people need to come and go. So Rachel, can I just ask you, are you okay to have a short session now if we bring Ed's session to a close at this point? Would that be possible for you?
Yes, great. I had something at 6:30, but I can stay until 6:40, but I can't really stay any longer than that, Hamish, if that's okay.
Okay, well, that's fine. I think we can fit that in. So, Ed, any last thoughts from you, and then we'll hand over to Rachel.
I'm looking at the chat, which is incredibly interesting, and partly about people in self-employment, also people talking about the trade unions and business working together and government. I mean, I think the point I would end on is, please engage with us. We will only get this right if business people, people with interest in this area engage with us as a party. Now, we need to create the vehicles for you to engage with us. Labour Business is a great way of doing it. But we will only get the policy right, the outreach right, if we do that. And then to reinforce what Keir said, today, we want people to take another look at us. I do think there is a big space in British politics for what I hope we can offer in 2024. We have massive challenges as a country. I think this is a great country, and we can definitely confront those challenges if we work together. So I really look forward, Hamish, to the dialogue carrying on through Labour Business and elsewhere.
That's terrific. Thank you very much, Ed, again. And we look forward to working with you on business engagement to build the evidence base and then build the policies. As you say, that's not for today, but we're going to have to come up with some policies sooner or later before the next general election. So thank you, Ed. Stay if you can, but if you need to go, we quite understand. So I turn next to our third keynote speaker, Rachel Reeves, whom I've already introduced. I would just say that we've had a long and very productive relationship with Rachel when you were chair of the BEIS Select Committee, and we put in quite a few submissions, I think, to your committee recently before you moved on to your current position. So in the context of the theme we're talking about today, what do we mean by a good business? We talk about Labour aspiring to be the natural party of business as well as workers and their trade unions, but we're clear that's not the sort of businesses that some of your reports referred to. So I was wondering, in the light of that, whether you wanted to address the question, what do you mean by a good business? And indeed any other aspect of this topic. So hand over to you, Rachel. Thanks very much for joining us.
Well, thank you very much, Hamish, for inviting me, and it's great to be back at a Labour Business event. Not being at a conference like you, I'm missing the glasses of warm white wine and soggy sandwiches, but we'll have to cope. We'll have to cope as it is, and indulge in double quantities next year at Labour Party conference. I also wanted to say how pleased I am to be back on the front bench under Keir's leadership, and I thought his speech today was absolutely superb, really focusing on the everyday issues of concern for people and exposing the errors and mistakes that this government have made, and the fact that they've made because the Conservative values are not I don't think, the values of the British people. But we've lost 4 elections now, not them. And I think Keir said the Conservatives have had more election winners in the last 10 years than we've had in the last 75. So there needs to be a bit of humility from Labour as well. Hamish mentioned my time on the BEIS Select Committee, and in that role, I really got to see the best and the worst of business. You'll all remember perhaps the worst, and the inquiry that I chaired into the collapse of Carillion, and that's what makes the headlines. What probably didn't make the headlines so much is some of the fantastic businesses and business organisations that came to give evidence to our Select Committee. Businesses that are creating high-paid, high-skilled jobs in this country, that are investing in local supply chains, that are reinvesting their profits in social good, that are changing their supply chains so that they are using less carbon and less energy intensive. Businesses that are proactively seeking out fantastic women to work in their organisations and paying them the same as men are paid. And 50 years after the Equal Pay Act, we certainly need more of that. So as chair of the Select Committee, I got to see the best and worst of businesses. And when we say that we're a pro-business party and a pro-worker party, I don't see any contradiction in that, because workers need successful businesses and businesses need their workers to be a success. And the Labour Party, for any route back to power, but also to be consistent with what we stand for and what we value, have got to be pro both. And that's the right place for us to be in. I want to say a little bit about COVID today and the government's response to that, but I also want to say something about Brexit, because I know that will be a concern for many of you who are here this evening, who run businesses, who work for businesses, who are trade unionists. And I think there is a parallel in a way between the government's response on COVID and the government's response on Brexit, because in both cases, the government have been unprepared. Now, on Brexit, those are choices of the government's making. That's not the case on COVID, but COVID was top of the government's risk register for many years before a pandemic and a SARS-like pandemic was top of the government's risk register for many years. And so there really is no excuse for the lack of preparation that went into it. The fact that our PPE supply chain had been run down over 10 years, the fact that the state had been hollowed out to such an extent that it was a struggle in the early days of the virus to meet the challenge. And the government's response to it, and this is where I come back to the story of Carillion, has been to outsource to some big outsource providers rather than use the capacity and the expertise that exists in the state, or indeed local businesses and charities that are much more rooted in the communities, and particularly now in the communities where the pandemic is so endemic. And it does make me really angry that the government have outsourced to some of these big companies who are failing to deliver the goods. And one of the reasons why we are on the verge of another full lockdown is because contact tracing and testing has failed. And that's something that Labour's been calling out right from the beginning. I remember one of the first interviews that I did, and I was asked, well, what would Labour do differently? And I said, well, we would route contact testing in local communities so that people didn't have to travel tens of miles. Well, now it's hundreds of miles that people are having to travel to get testing. So it's getting worse, not getting better in some respects. And the government cancelled contact tracing on the 12th of March. They've now been running to catch up. They said that we would have an app by the end of May, the beginning of June. Well, here we are approaching the end of September and we still don't have one. The government told people to go and eat out, to help out, to get back to work. And now they're saying do the exact opposite. There's been a total lack of consistency because of this government's failed approach, because of their incompetence, but also some of the decisions based on their values that they've made, not just during the crisis, but over the last 10 years as well. And it really is a similar story, I think, on Brexit. People voted to leave the European Union more than 4 years ago, and we've had 3 prime ministers since then. But we're still in a position where we are grossly unprepared for what is facing all of you working for and running businesses and trade unionists in just 100 days' time. Now, we'll all remember the election last year, even if perhaps we don't want to remember it, and the slogan of the government of "Get Brexit Done." And they told us, I can't remember how many times, that they had an oven-ready deal. Well, some of us are wondering, I think with good justification, whether the government remembered to turn the oven on. Because here we are with the deadline fast approaching, and we still don't know what Brexit means. A red, white and blue Brexit. Brexit means Brexit. But for people who actually have to plan for it and have systems in place, we still don't know what that means. And on top of everything we're going through at the moment, and your businesses and your workers are going through at the moment, I do think it is absolutely inexcusable that with just 100 days left, we don't know what systems and processes we're going to have to use and what the basis of our relationship is going to be with our nearest trading partners. And I think that the irony is not lost, I don't think, on anyone here, that this is a government who say they want to cut red tape, and at the same time, they have chosen to introduce £7 billion a year worth of additional red tape on businesses because of additional bureaucracy and customs checks. Now, look, there is some red tape that we know that the government would like to get rid of. The sort of red tape that they don't like is environmental rights, animal rights, or workers' rights, consumer rights. But in addition to that, they're imposing needless bureaucracy and needless red tape. We don't want that red tape, but we do want those rights that have been hard won by Labour people and the trade unionists, colleagues, over many, many years. I just also want to say something about trust. Those of you who work in business know that when you sign a contract, that your word is your bond and you've got to stick to it. And if it turns out that that contract doesn't work for you, you've got to negotiate your way out of it. You can't just unilaterally say, well, we didn't really realise what we were signing up for and we've changed our mind now. But that is the approach of this government. And again, the irony is not lost, I don't think, on any of us, that at a time when the government is saying there's going to be stricter rules on the rule of six, for example, or wearing face masks, and that if we don't stick to the law, then we will face the repercussions. But it's quite fine for the government to break international law because it doesn't suit them. It does seem to be one law for them and another one for the rest of us. And I think that breakdown in trust and that breakdown in that reputation of Britain as a country, I think is going to cause us long-term damage politically, but also for business as well. Because one reason why people like doing business in our country is because of our institutions and our respect for the rule of law. And if we don't have that, then what do we have? And so that's why we have been urging, and Ed particularly in that really powerful speech that he gave last Monday in the House of Commons, for the government to rethink this dangerous approach and then reneging on an international treaty. I think probably my time is coming to an end. But before I became a member of Parliament, I worked in business, in banking and financial services, and I sometimes wonder whether I've left the second most unpopular profession for the most unpopular profession. But I have a business background, but I also joined a trade union on the day that I got my first Saturday job because my dad told me to. And so I just end by saying there is no contradiction by being pro-business and pro-worker. We've got to be both if we want to come back to power. Keir said today that we've got to get serious about winning again, because in opposition, we have no opportunity to fulfill our purpose and bring into being the policies and the vision that we have for our country. And I believe that, you know, one day of a Labour government would be worth it. And we've got to get there again. We haven't been in power now for more than 10 years. All of my time as an MP has been in opposition. And this isn't what I came into politics to do. It's not what Keir came into politics to do. And all of you who have given your time and your money, your shoe leather to our party and our movement, it's not what you came into politics to do. So Keir said today, we've got to get serious about leadership, get serious about winning again. I'm absolutely determined to do that. And with the support of Labour business and all of our members and our trade union colleagues again, I believe that we can do that in 2024, and what a difference we will make. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. Rousing speech. If you can stay for just 5 more minutes, we'll take a round of questions, if that's okay. So who'd like to come in? I've got Rajesh. Who else? Bill, were you signaling earlier? I thought I saw you. No, Roy. Okay, so Rajesh, Roy, third one, and Peter. Rajesh, Roy, and Peter. So Rajesh, if you'd like to go first.
Thank you, Hamish. And hello, everyone. It's good to see so many familiar faces and also the names in the participant list. Those who don't know me, my name is Rajesh Agarwal, and I'm the Deputy Mayor of London for Business. And before joining City Hall, I was an entrepreneur myself. I founded a fintech company and grew it. So I know firsthand the challenges that are faced by the entrepreneurs and by businesses. And that's why it breaks my heart to see the businesses on a financial knife edge. Most businesses have seen significant decline in revenues and are struggling to survive, and many are going under. And by the way, there's no fault of their own. As an entrepreneur, I know that it takes blood, sweat, and tears to build, grow, and run a business. And that's why it's hugely important that we protect our economy, protect our business. A lot has been talked about how employees and employers need to work together. I want to today talk about one thing that we have done from London City Hall. Last year in July, we launched something called the Good Work Standard, which is a benchmark for high employment standards with a fair pay at its heart. It's criteria covering pay and conditions, well-being, skills and progression, diversity and recruitment. More than 80 employers of a range of sizes of sectors of businesses have collectively employing more than 200,000 staff. They've joined and been accredited. It's a great example how we have worked with trade unions collectively to provide better working conditions. All the employers who are successfully accredited under this are employers with the Living Wage Foundation. And the pandemic has now brought forward new challenges for employers. This includes step change in home working and powerful reminders of the importance of health and safety in workplace, worker voice, and the role that the employers play in supporting the mental well-being of the employees. So the core elements of the Good Work Standard are now more relevant than ever. Fair pay and contracts, a focus on well-being, very important in this COVID environment, flexible working, worker voice, championing diverse workplaces, and investing in the skills of the workforce and supporting young people to enter workforce. So this is just one example I want to show that what a Labour administration has actually achieved in City Hall, and it's making a difference to lives of many, many employees across London.
Thank you very much, Rajesh. Can I call on Roy and Peter next? If you could keep it short, and then we'll give Rachel a chance to respond. So Roy.
Yeah, and to be fair, Rajesh has covered some of the issues I was going to raise. I mean, I thought looking at the time, this might be the last opportunity to have one last shout out for an approach around tripartite working and partnership working. I suspect, however, that we're probably preaching to the converted on this call, because people who are members of Labour business probably share the same views and values as we all do, that it's in good interest, it's in good business interest to work with your employees and your employee representatives in terms of the trade unions. The UK faces a significant productivity challenge. We know that before COVID, and it's probably got a million times worse now. But when you look at the countries who have far higher and far better productivity than the UK, they also have this tripartite and partnership working approach. And just to emphasise that and to finish off my brief comment is one of the contributors on the chat, I think Dell, has made the point that he worked in Norway, in Scandinavia, and that's a country where productivity is far higher than the UK, and their approach is tripartite working, trade unions, employers, government and local government all coming together to achieve the success. And that's what we need to do in the UK. The challenge will be, how do we deliver that when we're in power? Because if we have to legislate, we've failed. And I mean that. If we have to legislate, then it's not going to work. We have to convince people that this is the way that we should work together, and this is the way to be successful.
Thank you, Roy. Peter, very quickly, please.
Yeah, again, picking up a point really that's been made in the chat that I felt needed to be represented, and that's really around the potential of public procurement. Traditionally when we think about politics, we think about legislation, but actually public procurement has a huge opportunity, or presents a huge opportunity. It's worth well over £200 billion in the UK pre-COVID, probably significantly more post-COVID, and how we use that public expenditure to drive not just the right decisions and giving contracts to the right sorts of companies, but how we can actually change culture within business as a consequence of rewarding good behaviour through procurement with such big prizes is a fascinating opportunity that has never really truly been exploited by either political party. There's a great deal of consensus around social value opportunities, but really, given the crises we're facing, it's an opportunity that we need to drive harder and faster. And any thoughts and reflections you have on how public procurement can really create a race to the top instead of this ongoing race to the bottom.
Thank you, Peter. Rachel, back to you for your final words.
Great. Well, thanks, Hamish. On Rajesh's point, and it's great to be here with you today. The second panel we've been on today, isn't it? I think that the point you make about the precarious state that so many businesses are in at the moment, and it being no fault of their own, and that's why Anneliese has spoken very powerfully yesterday, but on other occasions as well, about the need for a flexible furlough scheme. And the government now want to own the furlough scheme and the difference that it's made. Well, I think the furlough scheme owes more to Francis O'Grady than it does to Rishi Sunak, because it was the trade unions who got the government to act when at first they didn't want to, and now we need to make them listen about the need for a flexible furlough scheme, especially after the announcements that we've heard today from the Prime Minister about more curtailments on business activity, which of course is going to mean if you have to close at 10 o'clock rather than 11 o'clock or midnight, it means you're going to need fewer workers. You've got to have more flexibility in that furlough scheme. Roy's point, I couldn't agree more with you, Roy, and the productivity challenge that we face and have faced now for more than a decade. We've never recovered in terms of productivity from the financial crisis, while other countries have, and it's a whole range of issues. Poor management skills, lack of focus in our educational system on the vocational, poor infrastructure, poor broadband, lack of childcare, which holds women back, particularly in the workforce. All of those things need to be addressed, and none of them can be addressed by business on their own. It has to be done in partnership of government, business, and the workforce as well, and that's the only way I think that we're going to bridge that productivity gap. Peter, on public procurement, this is something since the Carillion inquiry that has become a real passion of mine, and something that as I said before, it does make me very angry, the way in which the government uses public procurement. I think that a lot more services need to be brought back in-house. I think that if test and trace had been done through the NHS and our local authorities, we would be reaching an awful lot more people, and those results would be shared in a way which would enable us to contain the virus in a way that just hasn't happened so far. But also, I think that public procurement should be used to support smaller businesses and local businesses as well, and to keep money in our local communities, but also because I think it delivers better outcomes. One of the reasons why the Serco test and trace model has not worked is because it's not part of the fabric of our communities, and it's not in touch with the people who it's trying to get to take action. And as a result, some of the poorest parts of the country, they're only contacting just over 50% of people, and that's not good enough. And local authorities are having to replicate the Serco system on the ground with door-to-door activity, which they're not paid for, and in some cases, including in Oldham, is being done by volunteers. So the Serco model is not working. It's been failing for years, frankly, and the government need to rethink that, and the Labour government certainly will, ensuring that more small businesses and local businesses can win contracts, but also insourcing services, because I believe then you would get better results for the taxpayer, but also, crucially, for the people who rely on those services. I've really enjoyed talking to you all this evening. Francis, I'm really sorry I can't stay to hear you, but I look forward to being back at a Labour business event soon. Thanks, Hamish.
Thanks very much, Rachel. It was lovely to see you. We'll move rapidly on because I want to give as much time as possible to somebody I'm really, really pleased to see at a Labour business event again, the leading voice of the trade union movement. And I think, Francis, you know from my earlier comments on what's been said and the endorsement of what's been said that we believe in good business, but we also believe in good trade unionism and workers and trade unions being part of a partnership with government. And I totally endorse what Roy said about that tripartite partnership. So we're really pleased to have you. And perhaps you'd like to talk a little bit about how we use that model of partnership to address some of the massive challenges that we've been talking about tonight. So, Francis O'Grady.
Well, thanks very much, Hamish. And just to say how good it is to be here, I think Labour business and unions share a lot of common ground in that we both stick up for the real economy when sometimes, when we see what's happening in steel and manufacturing at the moment, the real economy needs champions. And we both stick up for decent businesses and decent workers' rights. I think your timing, by the way, is great because, of course, this morning we heard from the Labour leader, and in my view, he came across as strong, as confident, a man of integrity. And then this afternoon, we heard from Boris Johnson. And by the way, to my knowledge, Keir Starmer has never privately or otherwise told business to F off. So I think we're on to a winner here. I hope we are. Just two key reflections from me, really, because I agree with so much of everything that's already been said. But I think it is worth acknowledging that I think during this crisis, there has been unprecedented cooperation between good business and unions. Everything, we've already heard that call for manufacturing to switch production to PPE and ventilators, hand sanitizers, that, again, we can say those things, but actually making it happen depended on businesses and unions working together, reorganizing shop floors, getting in different kit and equipment, skilling up workers. I mean, that was a tremendous, incredible effort. I think there's been a shared understanding that safety is key to unlocking the economy. That, we've had to learn the hard way, haven't we? That it only takes a couple of cowboy companies to shut down a whole city. We've seen that happen. And it could happen again. That's why I think together we both have an interest in being as tough on safety at work as we're hearing in terms of some of the behaviours that are now required by law in terms of our personal and social lives. We have to get safety at work right. And I think we've had cooperation too in recognising for the first time in this country that the best way to protect jobs was through a wage subsidy scheme. And in addition, we obviously a number of us spoke to the government about support for the self-employed. And in many ways, I think that job retention scheme has proved its worth. We've already seen that at its peak, it was supporting 1 in 3 livelihoods in this country. That has now reduced by half as firms have been able to get back on their feet, and working families who were staring, redundancy in the face had their livelihoods protected. The big question is what happens next? And the TUC has been arguing for a job protection and upskilling programme. Let's get people back on short time working. Let's have real plans about how we rebuild hours and productivity. During downtime, let's get people retraining and upskilling because that's an investment for the future. But we need to keep that link between business support and wages because we know that's the most effective way to protect jobs. And I would say this, that I think we, all of us, need to speak up and encourage the government to recognise that the biggest threat we face is mass unemployment. Anybody who went through the 80s, let alone our parents who went through the 30s, knows the devastating impact that unemployment has. You know, we talk in these phrases about it scarring a generation. The reality is, we know in our own families that where people have suffered unemployment, it is very difficult to ever get properly back on your feet again. We've seen it in the towns that we come from, that if they lost those big employers, if those employers went bust, a lot of those towns never, ever recovered. So it has to be, for me, not just at a human level, but because it is best for the economy. Other businesses will not thrive unless workers have wages in their pockets to spend locally. That's the simple truth. To keep the economy moving, to keep it growing, we have got to keep people at work. And that's why I think for us, this is an urgent priority. Yes, we're also talking about job creation, and we also want targeted help. And we've argued that why not have a national recovery council and sectoral recovery councils? You know, one of the great ironies of this, I know you won't find it hard to believe, businesses and unions are talking all the time. We're having bilateral meetings. The only empty chairs are those that should be filled by ministers. And I find that really frustrating, because I'm a great believer that all wisdom does not reside in union HQs or boardrooms or corridors of power in Westminster. You have to get everybody around the table to come up with, test out our ideas, come up with creative solutions, but share those values, that we understand that the economy works at its best when working people are doing well. And I guess that brings me to my second reflection, which is, we've all said it, we can't go back to business as usual. Again, another urgent problem, if you like, on my plate. TUC analysis, we've shown there are 2 million workers who are key workers who are directly dependent on the national minimum wage. These are the workers we all came out to clap on Thursday nights. They're now being told that they may not get the pay rise as planned in that national minimum wage in the spring. And frankly, I think that's a disgrace. I think ministers should be ashamed to even contemplate that those key workers, many of them social care workers, won't get a decent pay increase. And I think it's beholden on all of us. I think it's actually, I don't use this word often, but I think it is a moral issue that we need to repay the debt. And secondly, I think we have to do something urgently about insecure contracts, because I think what we've learned through this crisis is that, in fact, they've turned out to be a public health hazard. There is no worse symbol of the way this crisis has been mishandled by government for me than the fact that we now know that many social care workers on 0 hours and agency contracts were moving from home to home, spreading the virus, because that is the way they are expected and forced to work. I don't think that can continue. I think we have to be honest about the depth of the inequalities and the unfairness that we face. But I am really hopeful that if we do come together, we can make that case for a new social contract, a new deal for people at work. And I think what would be pioneering is for Labour Business to be the organisation of business that is saying loud and proud that we believe that decent rights for working people are the key to decent, successful businesses. The two go hand in hand. We should never accept that there is a trade-off or a tension between the two. We know that we can do this together, and that if working people have a voice and are treated with dignity and respect, that will make for better, more productive, more successful businesses, and that's what we all want to see. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francis. You can probably tell you're preaching to the converted here, and you have massive support for that message, and Labour Business will work with you to make sure we deliver it. And I have to say, I'd love to have another round of questions or comments to engage in that discussion further, Francis, but I'm going to have to call time because we've only got 5 minutes left. I want to call on Bill Esterson to say some closing words. And before that, was there anybody on the panel who hasn't spoken, that haven't called, who'd just like to get their 2 penneth in? Now is your chance, if you make it very brief, but don't feel obliged. I'm not seeing anybody who feels, oh yes, I do. And I wanted to welcome you back, Angela. Baroness Smith, leader of the opposition in the Lords. I know you had to leave earlier, but it's very good to see you back. Would you like to say just a few words before we move to the closing part of it?
A very few words, Hamish, and thanks for inviting me along. It's been between votes and other interviews today. I'm always find it refreshing to hear Francis as well. With a similar generation and similar backgrounds, as we both know, and I think it's reflected in our outlook on life and work. I've very little to say because of time, but I do want to pick up on just a couple of things. There's a note in there, perhaps for the future, from Simon Storer, who says, why not do these kind of round tables as a way of engaging with business throughout the year? And I think as we're doing policies, I know Bill's, who regularly meets up and talks to people, would find something that's really valuable. I just think it's a useful suggestion for us to keep this going through the year. As frustrating as it is to be zooming at a conference fringe, it maybe gives us some sort of a way forward on other issues. And I've worked with Peter in the past in social enterprise, where we were trying to say that social enterprises are charities, they are businesses, and that was a battle we had to fight a bit. But I'm sure that these kinds of round tables, where we could hear more from the audience, I've been following the Q&A questions as well. And I'm sure as we develop our policy making, that input from party members, trade unionists at all levels, people on the ground, will be really valuable. So I've enjoyed listening. Thanks, everyone. Apologies, I'm going to go because we'll be voting again shortly. But it's been a really great evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Angela, for joining us. And if I can just say on behalf of Labour Business, I mean, it is our programme of work to do business engagement activity right through the year in support of policy development, evidence collection, as I called it earlier. We will carry that suggestion forward. It is what we plan to do. It is what we will do. And we hope that you will join us in doing that, either by becoming a member or just signing up to receive our emails and our newsletters, or getting in touch with me direct, and I'll make sure that you can be plugged in, whether it's from the business perspective, trade union perspective, or Labour Party members' perspective. We need all of your voices, as Francis said. I want to say a very quick thank you to my executive committee. It's a voluntary organisation. We depend on subscriptions for our work. We're all unpaid. Our EC does a huge amount of work, and I thank them for it, particularly Frederic Provost, who is our vice chair, who is the master chef of everything technological that pulled this evening together without a single hitch, as far as I'm aware. And secondly, to the chairs and vice chairs of our policy groups, 9 of them, that work on a whole range of policy issues affecting business and the economy. And in particular, the vice chair of our economic policy group, Liz Minns, also of Social Enterprise UK, who's done an incredible job helping to put this event together. And now I want to turn to Bill Esterson, who, as well as being the Labour MP for Sefton Central, is also a shadow trade minister, and I'm proud to say a vice president of Labour Business. We're very lucky to have him. So it's over to you, Bill, to close off proceedings.
Thank you, Hamish. Good evening to everybody, and what a fantastic evening of brilliant contributions from everyone. And just to Francis's point, the input and support we get both from the unions and from the business community in the international trade team has been absolutely first rate in supporting us through the trade bill and now through the internal market bill and all of the challenges of what the government is doing, which I won't spend too long on. so many of my favorite people on this panel, actually. Two of my favorite entrepreneurs, Rajesh, if you haven't heard Rajesh's story about how he funded his businesses through going back when he was turned down initially to get a car loan that he then used to start a business, you must hear that story. And Peter. I've known Peter, I think, for pretty much all of the time since he's been in social enterprises, going back to the days of the Sunlight Centre in North Gillingham. And that's a story that you should hear from Peter too. But brilliant colleagues and a brilliant panel as well. And as Rachel, I was elected at the same time as Rachel. I want to be in a Labour government. What we heard today from Keir is a massive step in the right direction. Competence, credibility, offering hope, offering the answers through that investment in the green economy as a way forward, creating those jobs that are going to deliver the prosperity. And in stark contrast to the incompetence, the divisiveness, and the flagrant, brazen announcement that they were going to break international law and undermine trust and the country's standing in the world of Boris Johnson. So I look at this with great hope as we go forward. I'm really glad that Angela said what you did, because this can't just be a once a year where we get Labour politicians coming along and saying we must be closer to the business community. It's got to be all year. There are 6 million businesses. It's where the votes are at. The business community is crying out for Labour to be alongside, as well as being in partnership with the trade unions. As somebody who started and ran a business along with my wife, who is on the call somewhere as one of the participants, for 15 years we ran a business. She still does. This is something very close to my heart. And there are so many opportunities to do well. Peter kept coming back to the point about procurement. Absolutely right, Peter. I'll just finish with a story about my dad. My dad was the first ever inspector for computer education when he worked for the Greater London Council in the 70s. And he was tasked with they decided they were going to put computers in schools in London. First place in the world to do it. And one of the choices was IBM. No one ever got sacked for choosing IBM. He gave the contract to 2 blokes working out of a garage in Oxford. They went on to create and develop research machines now known as RM, whose computers these days are in most schools in the country. Had he got that wrong, it would have ended his career. But it just demonstrated the pressure that he was under to give the contract to the established firm. And that hasn't changed, has it? Serco, G4S, Deloitte, they get all these big contracts. And my word, they've made a mess of it, haven't they? Whether it's test and trace or procurement or anything else. The rewards for failure, because of the way we set up our procurement, are manifest. And Peter, you made the point brilliantly. Procurement is, if it's not a silver bullet, it's the closest thing we've got to rebalance our economy, because it's how you support startups and scale-ups, and it's how you support responsible business through direct government spending. The Americans do it through their Small Business Administration. I want to see us do it here. I want Labour to genuinely be that partner of business that drives a successful, progressive, forward-looking economy that offers jobs to young people, that offers hope for the future, and that works with our workforce to deliver. Thank you all for coming along. Thanks to our panelists, and thank you to Labour Business. Carry on the good work.
Thank you, Bill. Safe journey home, everyone. Back to your home or your living room if it's a shorter commute.
Well, I'm going to have that warm beer now that Rachel talked about.
The warm glass of wine or beer.
We didn't get.
Thank